Okay, awesome. So like Tal said, I'm a master's student with the University of Oklahoma and the Schusterman Center for Judaic and Israel Studies. And I will be talking to you guys about where Yiddish poetry and literature meets the American West and what we can glean from that about race. All right. So in 1921, after a year of traveling across North America to promote the Yiddish language, its instruction, and celebrating their recent marriage, Yiddish writer Henry Rosenblatt and his wife Molly settled into an apartment on Cincinnati Street in Los Angeles's Lower East Side, Boyle Heights. This LA neighborhood in the 1920s rapidly became the center of Yiddish life in the city, and by the end of the decade, 10,000 Jewish households resided in the area. In contrast to the immigration patterns of the East Coast cities like New York, Los Angeles did not see an influx of Eastern European Jewish immigrants until the 1920s and beyond. Thus, the development of Jewish and Yiddish LA occurred later from the 1920s throughout the 1950s and even beyond into the mid to late 20th century. This generation of Yiddishists and their children remembered Boyled Heights as the shtetl of Los Angeles, evident by their nostalgic LA Jewish Historical Society film, Meet Me at Brooklyn and Soto, which was, I believe, published in 1996. But it's very, very nostalgic, and their oral testimonies create this nostalgic view of the neighborhood. This memory of the neighborhood harkened back to a time where Boyle Heights was perceived as only a Jewish space, contradicting two historical realities of the neighborhood. Firstly, Boyle Heights was home to many other immigrant populations, and secondly, by the 60s and 70s, many of the Jewish residents and their families had moved out of the neighborhood, preferring middle-class suburbs like Beverly Hills, the Fairfax District, and San Fernando Valley. While this fantasy reimagines Boyle Heights as an inherently Jewish place, it obscures the multi-ethnic realities of the neighborhood. In addition to its large Eastern European Jewish immigrant population, Boyle Heights was home to a large populations of Japanese, Russian, and Mexican immigrants. During this 3-decade period between the 20s and 50s, racial discourse was vital in shaping Jewish immigrant consciousness as these immigrants tried to situate themselves within this particular Western city and American society at large. The Yiddish poetry produced by writers like Henry Rosenblatt on the surface combined popular Western motifs and Jewish motifs, creating a new Yiddish literary style. However, by analyzing the poems even further, we can see an intense struggle for understanding Jewishness in the terms of America's racial discourse. For this presentation, my two goals for this paper is to establish a need to reconsider what constitutes a Yiddish literary style, especially outside of New York. I think us as Americanists are very focused towards the East, and by shifting our perspective westward, I think we can see a really interesting and, like many of the other panelists in this conference has talked about, regenerative and new creative ideas of Western Yiddish literature. Secondly, promoting the Yiddish sources also complicate our understanding of race during the early mid-20th century, which I think is really vital to creating a larger picture, right? Okay. For this paper, I will contrast two Yiddish poems about Los Angeles. Sorry, I'm struggling. About Los Angeles, Henry Rosenblatt's I Sing to the Wild West, published in 1925, and a female contemporary poet, Shifra Weiss's California, second edition, published in 1953. I contrast how these authors discuss race in these two poems to demonstrate the tensions of racial otherness Jews experienced in the early 20th century and the eventual shift to describing Jewishness in terms more familiar with ethnic identity post-World War II. While the authors published these two poems at very different stages in their life, pre-World War II and post-World War II, both Rosenblatt and Weiss were foundational cultural producers of the Yiddish language and culture in Los Angeles during this time. Collectively, these two authors are a representation of a new Yiddish literary style, in my opinion, that emerged out of the West. But they also give us a glimpse into how Eastern European Jewish immigrants who identified most with a radical secular Yiddish identity viewed and understood the rapidly changing conceptions of race during this period. As many scholars before me have noted, the path to whiteness has been a complicated and a non-linear process for Jewish immigrants, and these Yiddish sources further complicate and add to our growing body of scholarship to analyze these dynamics. To begin, as we see here on slide 3, Chaim Rosenblit, or Henry Rosenblatt, was born on May 15th, 1878, in the village of Rishoshe Podylia, now known as Ukraine. He received a traditional Jewish education at the time, which involved the local Hadar school. In 1892, with his parents, Rosenblatt traveled to the United States, first passing through Ellis Island before settling in New York. The family settled in Brownsville, and like many other Jewish immigrants at the time, Rosenblatt worked in garment factories to financially help his family. Once he felt the family's finances were secure, he later studied at the Jamaica Normal College in New York to be a teacher. It was here that he was introduced to the English language and English literature, and he began to combine American and Jewish themes in his work. He would also publish a few poems in 1900 with the Forverts, but in 1916 he moved to Detroit and served as the editor of the Detroiter Volkenblatt, or the Detroit Weekly newspaper. Here he also met his wife Molly, and they married in 1920. It was on this honeymoon/Yiddish teaching tour where they first met the Yiddish community of Los Angeles. Once Rosenblatt completed the tour, they settled on Cincinnati Street in Boyle Heights, the center of Yiddish life in Los Angeles, and historians Max Vorspan and Lloyd Gardner, the first to complete a historical account of Jews in Los Angeles, noted Rosenblatt was the foremost writer of the city. His poetic style combined the Yiddish movement of the Die Jung, or the young ones, art for the sake of art, and motifs of the American West. Let's see here, the next slide. The other poet I will be discussing is Serra Weiss. She was born in September 1889 in Kelm, Lithuania, and at the age of 12, her father, Nachman Roif, was murdered in a nearby town, and subsequently she was orphaned. By the age of 15, she had committed herself to the Jewish Labor Bund, and because of her political activities, she had to flee Lithuania due to persecution by the local police. She fled to the United States in 1905 and briefly lived in Chicago and Pittsburgh before permanently settling in Los Angeles in 1917. In Los Angeles, she was active in the Jewish labor movement, socialist and communist, and contributed to the founding of the local Arbeiter Ring, or the Workmen's Circle, school in Hollywood. She published poetry in Yiddish journals around the world, and local Yiddish committees in Los Angeles helped publish all 4 of her books. Her writings, in contrast to the Die Jung movement, again, art for the sake of art, was much more politically oriented as she moved away from socialism and dedicated herself to communism. Before moving to LA, Rosenblatt met a welcoming, albeit small, Los Angeles Yiddish community of writers, intellectuals, and activists during his North American Yiddish tour. For the Rosenblatts, it was undeniable that the fair weather and the laid-back living style of Los Angeles triumphed over the often cramped and cold living conditions of cities on the East Coast, and they lived there until his death in 1956. Within 4 years, Rosenblatt immersed himself into the local Yiddish literary scene and joined the locals' Writers Club with other influential Yiddish writers in the area, Jacob Ginsberg, Wael Malamud, and Israel Friedland. Other writers, intellectuals, and activists like Serra Weiss, because she was there a few years before him, were associated with the local Arbeiter Ring, which provided needed financial and organizational support for the blossoming Yiddish community. Within 4 years and after one failed attempt, Rosenblatt and the other local writers, collectively calling themselves the Group West, successfully published Los Angeles's first Yiddish language literary journal, Mayrev, or West, in February 1925. In this first issue of Mayrev, local writers contributed poetic works, local commentary, and short stories. Both Rosenblatt and Weiss contributed poetic works and would continue to contribute into journals after Mayrev failed due to the disbandment of the writers group. Los Angeles would have about 4 literary journals published during the 20th century. The longest running one was published first in 1946, Heshbon, and it lasted until 2008. Okay. All right. So I Sing to the Wild West, published in 1925 by Rosenblatt. He begins this poem by invoking prominent Western myths of frontier times, the pioneer journey westward, and the violent conflicts with indigenous groups. Our ash gray covered wagons did not move on, not drawn over your white Sierra defiles. We supplicated in our prayers the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. not bending our heads over loaded rifles. It wasn't our tents ignited that burned under your steel blue, night frigid sky, on your black bodied prairies as fresh red bloodied wounds. How can broken spines, which dust gray peddler sacks are laden, sway elastically to the rhythm of gold in your copper pans? How can the hands that held the wandering rod for generations and generations on all the condemned roads of exile combat your copper arms and steel fist and scalping knives? In this beginning stanza, he clearly states Jews did not play a part in the violent settling of the land. This narrative is like the nostalgic view of Boyle Heights as it obscures historical realities. Jewish immigrants were present during this period, albeit a few, in American history, and scholars like David Kaufman and his work, The Jews Indian, Colonialism, Pluralism, and Belonging in America, have demonstrated that Jews benefited from the American expansionist project of manifest destiny. However, in this particular narrative, the Jew is an outsider and falls in between the racial categories of indigenous people and white Anglo-Saxons. Like I mentioned previously, Rosenblatt associated himself with the Yiddish literary group Die Jung, the Young Ones. This generation of Yiddish writers promoted the art for the sake of art and focused less on political themes that we see in earlier garment workers' poetic works, and more so on natural themes. Walt Whitman and Emerson were really major influences on this poetic tradition. And many other writers of this movement sympathized, like many other writers like Rosenblatt, sympathized and saw similarities between the Jewish and indigenous experiences. However, these Jewish writers employed the image of America's indigenous groups to negotiate their own Americanness. Thus, Yiddish immigrant poets sought to use the image of indigenous peoples to express their own in-betweenness in this period of American society. And as Rachel Rubenstein notes, these writers reconstituted the Indian and Walt Whitman as paradoxically, quintessentially American and alien. That is both American and Jews. Rosenblatt sympathizes again with the indigenous experience evident by the violence portrayed in this poem. However, he focuses more so on the collective Jewish experience expressed in wandering exile in combination with the myth of the American West. His connection between Jewish and American themes further tied Jewish immigrants in America to the old world of Europe and the oppression they experienced there, with the new world of America, the American West, and the opportunities that lay ahead. As we see further into the poem, he questions how Jews with distinct racial traits and narratives can integrate into the American West. Race and racial characteristics during the 1920s, while clearly demarcated certain groups based on inherent characteristics, also functioned as a means to connect to these groups during this time. In The Price of Whiteness, Jews, Race, and American Identity, Eric Goldstein observes more than any other term for self-definition during this period, race provided a feeling of community and connection for other Jews, and it was something they sorely needed in times of great tension and uncertainty. Again, the mentions of peddling and the wandering rod of exile connected Jews across geographical regions in this narrative and provided a foundation for the diasporic Jewish immigrant consciousness, even in remote places like the American West. He finishes his poem by emphasizing the regenerative properties Los Angeles had specifically for the Jewish people and for Yiddishists. We too will be confused in your maelstrom of your big city streets. We too will be blown about the hot whirlwind of your nimbly oncoming generations. But a generation of ours will arise still over the ash hills of your long extinguished generations, as Phoenix arises from its own destruction and fire with colorful widespread wings, young, nimble, and new. The Jew is no longer on the periphery in the West, but is front and center in this ending narrative, right? The poem, as historian Caroline Luce states in her own research about this specific piece, functions as a strong assertion of Jewish otherness, a rejection of assimilation, an embrace of a modern secular Jewish identity rooted in Yiddish culture. In the eyes of Rosenblatt, and Jews could still be Jews in Los Angeles because this fantasy, the city functioned as a fluid racial landscape, a place of inclusion, but without total assimilation. However, this fantasy makes no mention of the actual racial minorities that lived within the city and even his own neighborhood. So in comparison, we will see with Shifra Weiss's California, the second edition published in 1953, does represent the racial and class realities of the city and specifically highlights the oppression Mexican immigrants faced. In the entire piece, she contrasts the natural beauty of California and the violence and oppression experienced by its inhabitants from white perpetrators. Both the whites conquered with guns and with powder, driving them into the folds of the valleys, the palms, the flowers, the land, and the sun taken into their power. The nuts, the grapes, and the oranges taken from themselves into their barns. On paths bitten into stone, there flow together the endangered lives of Mexicans, surviving bloodied eyes of Indians, and sun soft in gold. On glowing screws, red as fire, we descend into the depths of Yosemite Valley. But it's the blue knights, their blue knights are torn from their flesh by whips of white overlords who swindle and tear out the gold from beneath the coffee skin which the Mexican sun had burnt in over generations. I've only attached snippets of this poem. This poem is about 3 pages long. But she continues to talk about the oppression experienced by other immigrant populations, and even critiques the exploitation of both those who seek California for health reasons and the working class during this period. Obviously, she begins by stating who committed the violent settlement of the land, white Anglo-Saxons, but then she continues on how that violence affected Mexicans and indigenous groups. Like Rosenblatt, she ends the poem with a somewhat hopeful tone, though, stressing the importance of a multi-ethnic partnership. With juice of oranges, with the gold of the land, with the daughters and sons of all the world, we inscribe a new chapter in the history of the world. We may be trusted with the sun, we break, we clean, we build, we forge steel wreaths, we emerge from the Pacific harbors to cut thick icebergs into ribbons. So we will be seen as a forest afire with the sun in our hands, with daughters and sons of the 7 seas, we will anchor life just as we please. Like, again, Rosenblatt, I don't believe Weiss's intention was total assimilation into American culture, but instead more of a Yiddishkeit internationalist approach. For both poets, the Yiddish language and culture is key to maintaining a distinct Jewish ethnic identity, but Weiss does not create a fantasy of Los Angeles or Boyle Heights. She instead created a narrative where Los Angeles's immigrant populations could ascend the racial realities of the city together. To conclude, writers like Henry Rosenblatt and Shifra Weiss were foundational contributors to Los Angeles, Yiddishist identity. However, both authors created distinctly different narratives about racial realities they experienced in Los Angeles and their neighborhood, Boyle Heights. Henry Rosenblatt envisioned a place where Jews could integrate into American society and through Yiddish were able to maintain a collective Jewish identity. But in doing so, he obscured the actual relationship Jews had in Los Angeles with other racial groups. In contrast, Shifra Weiss placed the realities of the multi-ethnic neighborhood front and center. In her narrative, Yiddish is still important to Jewish identity, but it's through the bonds between multiple ethnic groups that will create the Western city of their fantasies. I am done.